Charlie Musselwhite looks over at me. He goes, "You want to go get a burger?"
Hey, Rob, how are you doing?
Yeah, everything's going okay. I'm just working on some stuff from home here. I've been getting busy. People have been sending me projects to play on, so that's a good thing, you know.
Yeah, that's nice. So are they people you've worked with before?
Well, yeah, they actually are. These are some of them are clients that have sent me stuff before, but now they're home with a lot more time, so they're anxious. Somebody sent me a Pat Metheny tune that they wanted me to play on, and then it's like a four-page chart, so I'm going to have to do some shedding for that one. And then just some friends that want to do a video, a stay-home video, you know, and hey, can you play a little bit on this? And I'm going to play my trumpet and my piano, that kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. So you've done some serious session work over the years, haven't you?
I have. You know, it wasn't something that I started out wanting to do. It just I kind of fell into it. I think what happened was I was playing in some blues bands, like a lot of harmonica players start out, but this was back in the '60s, and I was in New Jersey, and the blues stuff wasn't really catching on, like it was in Chicago or I guess in other parts of the world as well, like in England. So it was hard. It was hard to get gigs. They thought blues was like this slow music, and and I would tell them, no, you know, there's some great upbeats. It's not just slow music, you know. But it was hard to get gigs, and it was frustrating. So I think that kind of led me to believe that this is going to be a tough way to go for me. Here I am, a white kid from the suburbs of New Jersey, trying to play blues, and it was working, and I felt good. But I wanted to play my harmonica more, and when the band broke up, I realized that wow, this was cool, but now I know 40 blues songs. I know the words and I know the harmonica parts, kind of half-assed to a couple of blues songs, and I went to put another band together, but I couldn't communicate with the musicians, and it was really frustrating that I couldn't do that, and it bothered me. So I started searching around. You know, I had no formal music training. I'm a 16, 17-year-old kid, and I'm trying to put a band together, and I can't even tell them what a 5 chord is and a 1 chord and all that. So I kind of just taught myself. You know, my two brothers played guitar, and I would watch them, and when they left the house, I would take their guitar out and try and mimic some chords and teach myself a little theory. Then I was working part-time and going to high school, and I saved up a little money, and I said to my mom, who was working as a secretary at the time, I knew she played a little piano by ear. We never had a piano, but when we went over someone's house that had a piano, she would sit down and play, and she sounded really good. But after she was done with those few songs, she couldn't even tell you where middle C was. So I asked her to buy a piano. I saved up like $700. I said, "Ma, can we get a piano for $700?" You know, she goes, "I don't know. I'll go out to Kenilworth Music and I'll check on my lunch break and see." You know, and she found a Kawai upright. They brought it to our house. It was $700, brand new, and I couldn't play a note on it. Just like my mom was like, didn't want to deal with it, like the theory of it. And I just sat down a little bit every day, and I had my harmonica, and I would kind of teach myself little chords here and there, and that's how I got into that. So the session thing, to make a long story short, it kind of grew out of that because I realized that when the bands weren't happening or I couldn't get the right musicians to play in the band, I wanted to still play my harmonica, and I was only a half hour from New York City, and I knew there was something going on over there. I didn't know exactly what it was. And when I went over there, I realized, wow, you really need to know about music if you're going to over here, because they've got Broadway shows and they've got films and jingles and commercials, but they want you in and they want you out. That's what I was told. So I figured I'd better learn how to read music, and that's when I got into it.
Yeah. So did New Jersey have much of a music scene, or did everyone just go to New York for music?
they had their own scene, but it wasn't as hip, you know. Sort of like, you know, in London it was probably a very hip scene, and in the burbs it was hip, but you know, it was like more like you're playing the top 40 songs and stuff that was out. But in New Jersey it was very how do I say, commercially oriented. So they wanted to hear the Four Seasons and these doo-wop groups, and it was good stuff, but that's not what I was into. I was just starting to get into the Beatles and the Stones and Motown and some blues, you know. I kind of was introduced to the blues. My mother owned a candy store, and these teenage characters used to come in, and we had a jukebox in the back, and they would buy a pack of cigarettes and have a cigarette and go back and play songs in the jukebox. And I was kind of introduced to Paul Butterfield, a friend of mine who was kind of this artsy greaser guy. He smoked cigarettes and he had his hair back. You know, he came in one day with his sketch pad, and underneath his sketch pad he had a Paul Butterfield LP, and it was the first one. And he gave it to my older brother, and he goes, "Hey, you guys might like this. You know, check this out." You know, and we just wore that record out. We thought it was the coolest thing. It didn't even sound like a harmonica. It sounded like a saxophone, right? And that was my introduction to the blues. I didn't know what blues were, you know, at that point. I started then going to the library and taking out Sonny Terry and Sonny Boy 1 and Sonny Boy 2 and learning, like, wow, this is where the blues stuff came from, not from Paul Butterfield, you know. And so that was my introduction. New Jersey wasn't very hip.
It's interesting what you say about, you know, almost having to persuade people, no, blues isn't this slow, depressing thing, because I don't know what it's like in the US these days, but it's kind of like that here now. It's almost a dirty word, blues, and you sort of don't want to say it. And you kind of, sometimes I find I'm describing my band with every word I can except blues, even though we're a blues band, because I know when they hear us that they'll realize there's energy and emotion to it. You know, but you say blues and they think of Robert Johnson or something like that, which is great, but they're scared it won't fill their bar or whatever, you know.
That's true. And you know what brings me to a good point, what you said about, you know, you kind of have to like always prove yourself, because there's people out there that aren't music people, and they just hear the word blues and they freak out. They don't want to hear, they want to hear something else. And that's when the light bulb went off for me, because I was like, you know, I like this music. Why doesn't anybody else like it? But you know what's funny? In 1980, when the Blues Brothers movie came out, the whole world, like in a weird comical way, found out about blues through these two comedians. And at first, I didn't like it, because it's like, yeah, they're putting on a hat, they're putting on sunglasses, and they're making fun of the music that I really like here. You know, what are they doing? You know? But then I realized what they were doing in this little funny skit was exposing this music to the whole world. And then fast forward to 2000, when I got called to join the Blues Brothers, I almost hung up the phone. I'm not putting on a hat and sunglasses for anybody, you know. And but I realized after I started doing it, because I needed the gig, you know, how important it was. Then I started seeing young kids, 4 and 5 years old, on their parents' shoulder, coming out to shows. They're singing the words, the parents are singing the words, and they're moving and grooving, but they're getting to hear music from Stax and Memphis and Chicago that they would have never, ever in their lifetime been exposed to. So you know what? A lot of good stuff came out of that movie.
Yeah, I mean, so you kind of answered my next question partly, because I was going to ask you about the Blues Brothers thing. I mean, I remember as a kid seeing the first film. I mean, it was before my time, but I remember seeing it. You know, we must have got it on VHS or something. But I remember the Blues Brothers 2000 coming out, because I would have been 11 years old at the time, and I went with my dad to the cinema and we watched that. And there's a kid in it playing, you know, well, John Popper playing, but you know, the kid's miming. Yeah, just kind of those two films together, because you know, by the time I was growing up, like that, along with a little bit of British blues stuff from the 60s, but not so much. I think it did a lot for introducing people, as you say, and it kind of reminds me of recently the Stones put out a new blues record, and no, you know, no one would say Mick Jagger's a great harmonica player, but again, you've got to say, hopefully, I mean, it was top of the charts here and stuff. Hopefully it's again reminding people of the blues and reminding people of the harmonica and getting out to a new audience.
Right, and you gotta you gotta throw out props to bands like the Rolling Stones and even the Beatles too. But the Stones were really into the blues, and Brian, the guy that started the Stones, he took Mick and Keith out and said, okay, Chuck Berry's cool too, but check, and they'd go to see Cyril Davies, in a coffee house, and then and guys like Mail and stuff like that were really researching this music, and so between Paul Butterfield, the Blues Brothers, and the Rolling Stones, and a little bit of the Beatles too, because they were more pop, but they were introducing that harmonica sound, the bluesy sound. Between those four things, I think they were seminal. Those four artists were seminal in bringing the blues, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf's music, and B.B. King to the world. And I know I'm getting a little bit off track here, but if you did a little research, Paul Butterfield and Mike Bloomfield from that band was a second generation blues band from Chicago that used to do what Brian and Mick did. They went out to these clubs and they went to hear Muddy and Howlin' Wolf, and if they got up enough nerve, they might have even got up on stage with them. But the point I'm trying to make is that they exposed this music to the masses. They took it out of there and said, hey, everybody should be hearing this stuff. And when they finally made it, like when Butterfield made it, he went out to California and he met Bill Graham from the infamous Fillmore East and West. Bill Graham was hiring hippie bands, and Paul Butterfield, they were jamming, and the Quicksilver Messenger and the Grateful Dead. And Butterfield said, this stuff is great. And this jam direction that we're going in is great too. He goes, but you need to hire the guys that wrote the book on this stuff, the real fathers of rock and roll. And Bill Graham's going, well, no, you guys are rock and roll. You guys were making rock and roll here in the 60s. And Butterfield said, you need to hire Muddy Waters. You need to bring Howlin' Wolf out here while they're still alive, and B.B. King and Aretha Franklin. And he's going, nah, that's not what the kids want to hear. The kids don't want to hear that. And they said, yes, they do. And he took a chance on what Paul Butterfield was saying and Mike Bloomfield were saying, and it took off. So all that stuff, the Stones and Paul Butterfield, man, my hats go off to those guys because they kept at it.
Yeah, yeah. So if we go back a little bit to the Blues Brothers thing again, how long did you do that for?
The Blues Brothers?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the Blues Brothers was the year 2000. I got the call, and I'm doing it to this day. I don't know how much longer it's going to go on. The guys are getting older, and we've lost Matt Guitar Murphy and Donald Duck Dunn and some of the guys that were the originals in this band. So it's been going for 20 years. And I've been having a lot of fun with it. I love playing with these guys. I love hearing the stories, from these guys. I remember sitting down at dinner with Matt Guitar Murphy and asking him, I want to know about the Memphis Slim sessions. What was it like to play guitar with Memphis Slim? And they'd tell you some stories. And Steve Cropper told you about working with Otis Redding, or just working with John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd when they first had this concept. They were out in Oregon, and John Belushi was shooting a movie called Animal House, and it was sort of a goofy film about college life, but at night the whole crew and cast would go out to these blues clubs because there was nothing to do in Eugene, Oregon, after they did a day of shooting on the set, and they heard this guy Curtis Salgado, who was playing at the time, and Robert Cray was playing guitar, and Dan Aykroyd came out from New York to hang with them and say, wow, how's the movie going? And John Belushi said, no, come out to this club, man. These guys are playing some blues, and they had the idea to put that skit together. So it grew out of that, and then it became a thing, But for me, it's been kind of weird as a harmonica player. I started out playing in blues bands like we all do. And then for me, I kind of made that direction where I wanted to switch because I wanted to never have to turn down a gig. And also I was starting a family. I had two young. I had my first daughter was on her way. Now we're going back to the beginning of the '80s, and I got a day gig. I was making some money. I bought a house. I had a mortgage payment, and here I am. What am I going to do? So I started playing. I put a wedding band together on the weekends to make extra money. I learned how to play standards on my harmonica. I still kept playing in the blues bands. I was opening up for Sly and the Family Stone and B.B. King with my blues band in New Jersey, which I thought was, wow, that's pretty cool. But that's what a blues band did back then. We couldn't get, regular gigs. So we opened up in concerts, and I befriended this guy named Bruce Springsteen down in Asbury Park.
Oh yeah, I think I've heard of him.
You've heard of him. And back then, I was playing a little more guitar, and I would play some chords and better take the pick out of it first. And I put on a harmonica rack kind of a thing around my neck, and I was working out some stuff, not Dylan-y, but maybe original rock kind of tunes. And he came to one of my shows. This was before he was Bruce Springsteen, and he really dug the way I was playing harmonica in the rack with the guitar thing. And I went down to some of his shows, and he would say, "Rob, you got to bring your harmonicas down, at the Student Prince in Asbury Park. I'm doing this blues jam on Tuesday nights." And I was about an hour north of them. And I said, I'm thinking to myself, it's a little far. And I never went. I never went to this blues jam. And 2 years later, maybe this was like around 75, I see him on the cover of Time and Newsweek magazine. And I said, that's Bruce Springsteen. I should have went to his jam session. Maybe I could have, the next Clarence Clemens or something. Did
you ever run into him later on?
All the guys in the band I know. I never ran into him again. He became so big. I never ran into him. I went to see him. He played at my college, and I had already known him, but now he was famous. And he was playing at our orientation, so it was like an outdoor concert. And I ran into Max Weinberg, who I knew, the drummer, and I said, "Hey Max, I'd love to come back and say hi to Bruce." He goes, "Well, he's in the back playing cards with the guys." And so I said, "All right, tell him I said hi." And that was it. I never saw him.
Like sliding doors or something, that isn't it?
Yes, it's interesting.
So obviously the Blues Brothers thing's been big for you, but then you've also, how long have you been involved with the Blood, Sweat and Tears stuff?
So the Blood, Sweat and Tears came in between the Blues Brothers thing. I was doing the Blues Brothers in the 2000 to 2020. So let's say around 2005 or 2006 to about 2011, I was doing both. I got a call because the singer, David Clayton Thomas, great singer, who was on those hits, Spinning Wheel and When I Die and stuff, he was living in New York, and he had a little falling out with the management or something and went back to Canada. And they wanted to keep the band going, and they said, well, Rob Paparozzi, he's a good front man, he's good with a microphone. And I said, yeah, but I don't really know that stuff. I remember hearing it on the radio. And they said, well, why don't you learn it and see? We don't know if this is going to fly without the original singer, but we need a front man. So I learned all the songs, and I was doing it 5 or 6 years, and nobody said anything, and everything was cool. I knew David Clayton Thomas, the original singer, because he had me in as a session harmonica player, and I played on 3 or 4 of his solo records. So they kind of knew who I was at that point, but they didn't know me as a singer. So they heard I sang, and they took a shot with me.
And did the singing just come out of necessity because you were putting a band together, so someone had to sing?
Yeah, I had no formal training for vocals. I just kind of did it, and because it was, like you said, necessity. You start a blues band, who's going to sing? Well, I don't know. Liam's got to go, let him sing, and everybody took a song. I kind of became the singer because nobody else wanted to step up to the mic.
Yeah. Well, you must have got good at it if you got to the point where, these big touring bands were, wanted you.
Well, I think I learned how to sing. We have to do that if we're going to be singers. And I consider myself a pretty decent singer, but I think where my strong point is as a front man. I saw the art of that and the need for that when I stepped out on that stage, whether I was playing in a coffee house or opening for, Sly and the Family Stone. I saw that every audience was different. And as a front man, I almost felt like, wow, I'm out here singing, that's cool, and I'm playing some harmonica, but it's almost like my job to make the connection between that audience and this great band behind me here, who's going to make the connection. And that became my mission too. So I developed some frontman chops.
Do you think that came naturally to you? Are you quite open and interactive like that with people in general?
No, I was very shy in high school, and I wouldn't, I didn't say much. So I was kind of quiet. But it's funny, I found a new life on that stage.
Yeah.
And then I guess I just naturally became more outgoing once I saw I had this talent for that. Yeah. And it didn't come easy. It just kind of happened.
Yeah. So, you've done some pretty big frontman stuff and harp stuff and session work as well. Along with that, how much stuff are you doing with Hohner?
Hohner's a great company. I've been with them. I had a short little break with them, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago when they were going through some changes in the U.S. But I was with them since 1984, and I'm still with them today. And I haven't done any things where I've developed, harmonicas with them or anything like that. But I love their instruments, and I work closely with them as far as promoting their instruments. And I love their chromatics, and I like their diatonics. And what I did is I actually took the Big River, which sort of like the stepchild. Nobody really likes the Big River because when you buy a Big River, they're kind of, the plastic combs, and they're not real expensive models like the crossovers or the higher end ones. But I said, I can't really afford to be buying like $80, $90, $150 harmonicas. So I stuck with the Big River, and I had combs. People started getting into combs. Well, there was this guy back in the late 90s, Mark Lavoie, was one of the first guys that said, well, let's build some new combs for these things and see if we can make them better. And he came up with this Vermont maple comb. And then he came out with a titanium comb. But the bottom line was it sealed up the harmonica really nice. It made it tight, but not airtight, because I learned in the 60s, and I was pushing more air through my instrument because it was a little bit leaky. That's the way the harps were back then. They weren't airtight. They weren't, So I wanted something that I could push more air through without it clamming up. So I found that a lot of the later models were starting to get tweaked a little bit for overblows, which is a great technique. But that's not where I was coming from when I started. So I find if I had a harp that was set up for overblows, I could still play it, but if I hit it too hard, it was going to clam up on me. So I stuck with the Big River, and I contacted Tom Halchek, who kind of came up with a signature Big River for me, and it's pretty cool. He put my name on the back, and it's an aluminum comb, so it has a little heft to it. And it's gold anodized, so it looks gold, but it's not silver like aluminum. So it's gold anodized. And then he took the cover plates, which kind of had a nice ridge in them, which I kind of like because it didn't feel like it was going to slip out of my hand like a golden melody. Felt a little slippery to me. Mm-hmm. So he took those covers and he nickel plated them. So it's basically a Big River hot rodded, and it's a good instrument.
And do you sell them commercially, or is that they're just made for you?
No. So yeah, I had them made for me, and then Tom said, hey, why don't we try and make a signature model? You're a Hohner endorsee, and it's going to sell more Big Rivers if people find out that you can customize these things and make them into good machines, So yeah, so they are for sale at Blue Moon Harmonicas. We're about halfway through our first batch already. They're selling good, and they're not cheap. They're $125, but you're getting a signature model, and it's in limited keys. I think A, B flat, D, G, And there's like 5 keys. And if you really wanted, he'd probably make you up a special key in one. And it's no big deal. So they are for sale.
I'll make sure I put a link beneath the video then to Blue Moon harmonicas.
Yes.
With Big River, I started out playing Big Rivers. I think, just because they were cheap, and then I ended up. I mean, these days I play Special 20s most of the time. But I remember a few years after I stopped using Big Rivers, I saw a photo of Paul DeLay with a Big River, and I thought, and I'd really got into Paul DeLay, and I thought, well, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me.
That's great. That's great. And so, you figure a guy like Paul DeLay's getting a pretty nice sound out of him. And that's it's an issue too. I mean, the price is important because as harmonica players, we're filling up boxes of these things. And we're learning how to work on them now because on the internet now there's but not everybody's great with their hands. And I'll tinker with diatonics, but there's no way I'm messing with chromatics. And I'm so glad that we have some good techs out there finally that'll work on these for us. But you don't want to spend a lot of dough up front.
Yeah, I'm the same. I mean, I'm not very hands-on with all that kind of fiddly stuff. I prefer to buy a stock harmonica I love, or buy a custom harmonica that I love, and know that it's going to do what I want. And I wish I could take it apart and fiddle with it and do all this stuff. I know lots of people who can, but it's a different mindset, I think, and I kind of don't do it. So how are you in terms of, do you do a little bit then with the diatonics at least? You'll tinker a bit.
Yeah, I'll mess with the diatonics and mostly just tuning. Mm-hmm. and and if a gap needs to be adjusted a little bit, I can do that. And that's about it. So I have a minimal set of tools. I bought a scraper from Richard Slay in case I wanted to make a country tuned harp or something without going crazy, and that's it. Like I said, the chromatics, I use this guy Steve Malherbe out in California. Great, he used to do all Norton Buffalo's harmonicas, and he's a great technician. So the chromatics, I just ship them out there because all the movable parts in there and the slides and the valve covers and all that.
I did. I went to see. I don't know if you've had any interaction with there's a guy down in London or near London called John Cook who does loads of repairs, and he's a lovely guy, but he's got a lot of the equipment that was in the Hohner factory, but when they had to upscale from hundreds of thousands or maybe 1 million harmonicas a year to like 100 million harmonicas a year that they were having to make, they needed a different process. So he's got a lot of the machines that they had that work perfectly. It's just obviously he's not doing as many repairs and as many jobs as they are. So he's got all these beautiful, some of them are over 100 years old, these machines for repairing harmonicas. And he's got them in his workshop, on a high street, just in a town just near London. And I went and saw his workshop and chatted to him. And he's going to start making harmonicas from scratch as well. That's his next project. So he's got all the... He said he's got these like diagrams of how they built all the machines, again in the early 1900s or late 1800s, some of them, how they were building the stuff in the Hohner factory. And he showed me this thing and he said this was the British Secret Service got this after the war. He said the Americans got the rockets and we got the bloody harmonicas, So he's got all these original designs.
Oh man, that's really interesting. Really interesting. And thank God we have guys like that are interested in taking, because it takes the instrument further, and now we've got great harmonicas or tweaking them for what our needs are, whether they be overblows or whatever style you're doing. And we've got a lot of customizers out there, and they know what we want and they'll listen to us, and that's a good thing. That's a good time for harmonica players right now.
Yeah, it is. And the internet has obviously made the world a lot smaller, and it's amazing. I mean, I was talking to Howard Levy recently and asking him how it feels for all these crazy ideas that he kind of came up with. Obviously, he's unique, and that of course that's true. But there are now the ideas are out there. You see people popping up on the internet, and obviously he's got his own school online. People pushing these boundaries and trying all sorts of crazy stuff on on a diatonic, it's amazing, you know. And he was so positive about it, which I thought was great. You know, he said, you know, however many years ago I was just tinkering around trying to force this instrument to do something it didn't want to do, and now it's been formalized, people understand it, and you know, and yeah, it's democratized it. So on a kind of sort of related to that note, you mentioned the Chromatic a little bit. How did you start playing Chromatic, and how have you found that transition, or not transition, because obviously you're doing both, but yeah, tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, so actually the first thing that got my ears perked up about the Chromatic was you know, when I was listening to the Beatles, right? And they were on AM radio, and a lot of their hits, and they had like, you know, Love Me Do, which was basically like a bluesy kind of a lick that you could do on a C harmonica, like. And I could hear that, but then I would start to hear songs like. And I tried to play that on my regular diatonic. I said, well, he's playing like a major scale. It's not. And then I said, well, maybe he's using this other thing. And I saw in a green case that came in back then, maybe it's that thing called a Chromatic. And I was terrified of that button thing. And so that kind of got my ears perked up to it. But I didn't really know much about like this thing, third position, and what some of the blues guys like Little Walter and George Harmonica Smith were already starting to do with it. I found out about that years later. My mom told me about this guy, Larry Adler, and that's when my ears perked up, and I went to see Larry Adler play, and then I realized what could be done on the Chromatic, you know, after hearing Larry Adler. Yeah. And then from him, I found out about Toots Thielemans, who was this jazz guy from Belgium, who ended up in the United States eventually, and he was playing all this jazz stuff. So that kind of got my interest going, but I realized, wow, these guys were light years ahead of me from what they were doing. And then I found out about this thing in New York City that Hohner was, before I was a Hohner artist, they were having these like workshops. And they had a thing called the Harmonica Brouhaha, and it was a big get-together that they had at the South Street Seaport down in New York City at the Fish Market area. And you could come out this Saturday and meet Hohner's artists and learn about the harmonica and all the different players. And me and my friend, we were just playing a little diatonic at the time. We got to go to this, man. This looks really cool, you know. And this was probably in the late 60s, maybe 1970. I'm not sure. And when we got there was guys like Alan Blackie Shackner, who was doing session work in town on the harmonica, and Chamber Wong and Robert Bonfiglio were playing actual chamber classical music with like 3 harmonicas, you know, and reading these charts, and we're listening to all this stuff. We're going, wow, this is fantastic. So that kind of turned me onto a whole different side of the harmonica, and I got the bug. The bug had bit. Robert Bonfiglio at the end of his little concert, he goes, well, you want to learn how to play this? He goes, here's my card, and he gave me his card, you know. And I took him up on it. I called him a few months later and started taking some lessons, and I learned how to read music on the harmonica, on mostly the Chromatic, and the rest is what happened, you know.
I spoke to Corky Siegel yesterday, and he was saying, you know, I was asking him how he got into playing classical stuff, and he said, I think he said that a guy who was running an orchestra or something wanted him to introduce the classical audiences to blues music, and he said, I never wanted to do it. I didn't enjoy it. I was forced to do it. But then he grew to love it, you know. And I think it's great that, you know, you mentioned being scared of the button. I'm still scared of the button on the Chromatic, and I think it's great that there's so many different types of harmonica out there, and people playing different types of music, if you just know where to find it.
Right. And I remembered, I mean, even like when you start playing the Chromatic, right, you find out why are there 3 C's like right next to each? Why do we need 3 C's? And that used to drive me crazy. And, you know, which one do I use? And then as I started to talk to players that were playing, they said, Rob, it doesn't matter which one you use. It depends on the direction that you're going. And sometimes if you're trying to play smooth, so say you were playing a C scale, right? Like, well, that's a lot of in and out breathing, which is nice. It's even, out, in, out, in, out. And at the end, you have the little draw blow. But I said, what if I wanted, they said, Rob, what if you wanted to play this smoother, like in a jazzier feel? Why don't you use the button E, and use the button C when you get to the B. Now it's not so breathy, and I can play a little more legato and that kind. So I started getting all these little tips, and I write them down in a book, and I found Toots Thielman's phone number in a union book, and I called him up and would pick his brain and ask him about, what could I do here to sound like you and to get better and improvising. And then I met Magic Dick at one of the Jay Giles shows when I was in college, and I went up and I picked his brain, and he was nice enough to invite me backstage and talk to me for an hour, and learned a lot about diatonic stuff and who I should be listening to and that kind of thing. So it's been we didn't have the internet back then, and we didn't know. We had to just kind of get this information, write it down, and hope for the best,
I met Magic Dick when he was in London a couple of years ago, and he was the nicest guy. He sat down for like 2 hours with me chatting, and it was the middle of the night, and he'd flown over, obviously, jet lagged and all sorts. He'd done a show all night, and then we sat in the bar, in the back of the bar, and he was just, I think I stopped him in the end. I said, I've got to go home, I've got a 2-hour drive home sort of thing. But he was so nice and just, sat and talked the whole thing about his career. But it was kind of I think there was 4 bands on that night. So Giles Robson, British harmonica player who'd arranged it all, and Billy Branch was over, and James Harmon was over. And James Harmon was walking the other side of the camera, walking past us as Magic Dick's talking about all these kind of ethereal sort of magical concepts that he was saying that he thinks of with music, and you can hear James in the background going, it's all bullshit, what the fuck are you on about?
Wow. It's a strange world, the harmonica world, but you know what? We all learn from each other because it's not a formal it wasn't a formal instrument of hundreds and hundreds of years experience. So we all kind of took this instrument and learned from each other, and that's a beautiful thing,
Yeah. It's interesting to see how it's changed with the internet, because I can't remember who I was talking to. I was talking to, it might have been Paul Lamb. I think it was a British harmonica player who kind of said, for years they didn't even know what second position was, what cross-harp was, because whenever they asked a harmonica player, they'd actually lie to them, because it was almost like this secret thing they didn't even want them to know, and they almost had to work it out for themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's an old school thing. We call it old school here in the States. And I think a lot of guitar players were doing that, because everybody wanted to guard their turf. And you ain't getting my gig, man, And the guitar players would turn this way when they're showing you something so you couldn't see their hands. And luckily with harmonica, you don't know what we're doing,
Yeah, you're covering it anyway, So, I mean, with the teaching side, I know you teach, I've seen on your website that you offer lessons and stuff. How did that come about, and how much of that are you doing now? And is it just private stuff? Do you do workshops or anything like that?
I do both, and over the years, I've had an interest in teaching that goes way back, and I started taking lessons I had mentioned with Robert Bonfiglio, and then I also started studying. I found a guitar player that could teach me more stuff, and but nothing formal. I never went to school for music, but after Robert Bonfiglio, the classical harmonica player, started getting really busy playing all over the world with his concertos and stuff like that, he came to me and said, Rob, I teach at the Turtle Bay Music School in New York City, and that's where Chambers started teaching a master class that I had taken. So I knew that it was kind of being taught a little bit off the beaten path. he said, do you want to take over my teaching at the Turtle Bay Music School? And I said, do you think I'm good enough? He goes, well, yeah, you play all styles and you could do it, And he goes, I think you'd be all right. So I went and did that. And I started teaching chromatic, diatonic, anybody that wanted lessons. And I think at the time, Adam Gusso was teaching down at the New School. He was teaching more blues harmonica. But there was a need. There was a need for people to learn at the time. So I started teaching at the Turtle Bay. And I think years later, when I finished up and I started getting really busy, Dennis Grunling took over for a while. And because he was living in Jersey. And I met Dennis when he was a young kid. He used to come out and he used to come out and hear my band and stuff like that. And he's really turned into a great player. I love him a lot. And then I started teaching a little. People would call me, and I taught a little bit at home, one-on-one. And I also started putting little workshops together. I would put the workshops together like at my house. And I knew Howard Levy was coming into town. And Hendrik Merkins was over in Manhattan, and William Gallison and Robert Bonfiglio. I said, these are all great players, and they just happen to be in this area here. Let me bring them. And I opened up my house, and we have 3 guys downstairs doing chromatic, 3 guys upstairs doing diatonic, teaching, and a whole group of people. So the workshops have been something that have worked out okay for me. I did one with Steve Geiger last year around this time. So I enjoy teaching, and now I'm teaching more online because we have to, and it's not exactly the same, but it's good. It's good.
Yeah. And I know you're kind of in touch with some guys in the UK with what was the National Harmonica League, now Harmonica UK. Do you do stuff with SPA in the US? Because I don't really know anything about SPA, and I've always wanted to go. And one day I'll go to the festival. But is that a big thing?
SPA it's become a big thing, and I had joined it around 1977 when it was really it started out with like some older harmonica guys from Michigan, and they used to work in the Ford motor plant. They work in these automobile plants, and they used to play harmonica in the 50s with these Peg of My Heart bands kind of a thing, and it was funny because, I didn't really know. I remembered and I remember, okay, that's the old harmonica band stuff. But these cats said, let's start a club called the Society for the Preservation and Advancement of the Harmonica. And I said, that's kind of corny. But they had this newsletter. Back then, it was no internet. So they had a newsletter. And I said, well, I am kind of a harmonica geek, and I like all this information about harmonica. I'm going to sign up for this. And I joined them. But I noticed it was mostly chromatic players and bass harmonica and chord harmonica. Matter of fact, before I go on, and I'm jumping all over the map here, but let me play a little something. Well, the benefit of Mr. Kite. John Lennon song, but sorry. But I noticed that the guys from SPA were doing chord harmonica and bass harmonica. And I wrote a letter and I said, you guys ever, do anything? I know you have these conventions. And I wrote to this guy, Danny Wilson, who was sort of like their secretary at the time. And, I played mostly diatonic. It would be, that's a harmonica too. And then all of a sudden, another guy wrote me back, this guy, Eddie Manson, who was a legit classic, chromatic player. And he goes, well, the diatonic, that's sort of like a penny whistle to the harmonic. I'm going like, oh boy, we got attitudes going on here, But Danny wrote me back and said, Rob, don't worry about these guys. They're a little stuck in their own world. We would love diatonic players that come to our convention and that kind of thing. So I did this through the mail for a couple of years. And then finally, I think in the 80s, when I started working with Hohner a little bit, I said, maybe I should go out to one of their conventions and see. And sure enough, they had already befriended Peter Mad Cat Ruth, who was living out there at the time, or lived in Michigan. And I went to this convention, and it was like the chromatic and diatonic. The chromatic guys were over here on this side of the room, and a couple of diatonic players that showed up were over there. Nobody would talk to anybody. And I said, this is ridiculous, you know. And they invited, but Danny Wilson was hip, and he knew that the future was you got to include diatonic. You know, it's a big world out there. And so they had invited Charlie Musselwhite because he knew who Charlie Musselwhite. He goes, let's bring a guy who's making a living playing the blues, you know. And they brought Charlie Musselwhite out. And I'm sitting here and I'm going, wow, this is great. I'm getting to hear, you know, chord, bass, Charlie Musselwhite. So we're taking a break. And the same thing, nobody's talking to anybody. And Charlie Musselwhite looks over at me. He goes, you want to go get a burger? He knew, like, you know, I had nobody to talk to, you know. And I said, yeah, you know. And I befriended Charlie Musselwhite. We went out and had a burger, and he told me all about the old Chicago days and this and that. But that was my mission back then, was we got to stop this separation thing going on. If the harmonica and if these harmonica groups like the NHL, the UK in the UK, or SPA in the US are going to make this thing happen, it just has to be harmonica. You got to stop drawing the line. It's chromatic, it's diatonic, it's harmonica. And that was my mission. So I've been involved with SPA since '77 and been working hard with them to try and keep the wheel going.
So that was your mission then. I'll finish with, I'm not really sure what my question is, but I kind of want to know where you're at these days, you know, whether what your new mission is or what music is to you these days and what's exciting you at the minute.
Well, I guess I'm really, as far as the harmonica world, I'm really excited what's going on in it. And to see players like Howard and Jason and Dennis and a lot of players coming up and also opening up their horizons to the different kinds of music that they're playing on it is making me really happy, because that's why I kept at this so long to begin with. And I really wanted respect for this instrument. So when a composer or an arranger or a band leader wanted something different, they would reach out and say, you know what? We got a harmonica player that can do this. Because of harmonica, my biggest peeve is that harmonica players in general don't want to learn legitimately their instrument because they just want to play and have fun. But we want this thing to be a legitimate instrument so other people hire us. I mean, I'm looking at it from a business standpoint, sort of, but also a musical standpoint. We want to be able to play all kinds of music. And, you know, if Sting wants a harmonica player, there should be somebody out there that can play what he needs. You know, if somebody wants harmonica on a hit record that they know it's going to make it sound, that should be done in a Broadway show. Or even I got to play with the New York Philharmonic because they wanted a harmonica that they had heard in a movie called Breakfast at Tiffany's, you know, and that Henry Mancini wrote the music for. Well, we need trained harmonica players that can play this stuff, and that's going to advance the instrument. So that's my peeve. So these days, I still do the session work because I enjoy it, and it's a challenge for me. But I have this two different worlds things going on. I love to perform, as you know, and I'm also I got this other life as a front man and a lead singer and a harmonica player. And so I love going out and presenting my music on stage, and I love doing it behind a microphone in a studio too. So I'm still doing the same thing I've been doing for the past 40, 50 years, and I'm having fun with it. And as long as it's fun, I'm going to keep doing it.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Thanks for having me on this. This is great.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time. It's great to you know, I'm like a kid in a sweet shop at the minute, just talking to all my favorite harmonica players. It's fantastic.
Wow. Well, good luck with everything, Liam. And this is a great series. So thanks for having me be part of it.
You're very welcome. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Rob. Take care. Bye.